you. Now we're starting the third part, the discussion session, co-chaired with Professor Benjamin Jani. It will last about 40 minutes. I will start with two questions, then I will ask Professor Jani to continue with his questions and to give the final conclusions for this event's ending. So my first two questions are, how do these impacts, of course, the long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, so how do these effects or impacts vary across different cultural backgrounds? For example, the different perspectives between North America, Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, or the Chinese perspective? This will be the first question. And then after we have the answers at these first questions, I will continue with the second question. Thank you so much. Yes, please, Professor.
Well, I guess somebody should jump in here, so here goes. China, of course, has a long tradition of collective action and approaches to issues that involve community, but community should be understood at the national scale, and so that's really important, and it's not true in other countries. But this national perspective is what drives policy there, and so there's a kind of a hierarchy of interest and power, I would say, in China down to local level, and that hierarchy I don't think is so visible in Western countries. But I just throw that out there as a point from China's point of view.
Thank you. Somebody else, maybe?
Okay.
Yes, Eva, please.
If I may, yes. Well, I was thinking when talking about differences, we can both refer to the national levels, but we can also talk about regional differences, and I would maybe want to focus on both. I'm thinking about two levels, in fact. One thing is the restrictions that were imposed during, let's say, the pandemic. That is the restrictions which at various stages had varied regionally. And for example, in the case of Poland, they were, in the beginning, they were nationally equal, and then they varied due to different needs. So I would say, but in general, the restrictions were quite strict. And also because of, well, I would say they were respected. They were somehow followed because of a certain uncertainty that concerned the virus itself, right? So this is the level of restrictions. But on the other hand, we have the level of execution of restrictions, which is, I would say, extremely culturally based. Well, this is what I would dare to say. And the resistance towards these regulations and these restrictions varied regionally in terms of, in case of Poland, for example. So in large cities, I would say the resistance was smaller. That is, the restrictions introduced were followed in most cases, while in small towns they were less formalized, and I would say due to less formalized relations between institutions, residents, and business entities, and certain local trust or bonding social capital in smaller towns, I would say these regulations were not that strictly followed, right? So these are these basic cultural differences which I could observe during the pandemic itself.
Thank you so much, Eva. Other opinions?
I would join from the Hungarian perspective, and it is going to be a bit post-socialist perspective, because As you may know, in the post-socialist countries, the participation and level of participation was originally not that high, and the meaningful involvement in urban decision-making process was very low, and it is still very low. But we had some kind of expectations, like the virtual platforms will help this decision-making process to bloom and to help the involvement. And in some cases, yes, it helped. And as Eva mentioned, in some cases, urban population involved themselves in these decision-making processes even more, and the rural just stayed behind a little bit. So despite the digital gap decreased during the COVID pandemic, and we saw some kind of processes of the decreasement of the digital gap, but still in urban decision making, the expected result, like the full involvement of people, just did not happen, and that is due to the original position of people, that the cultural setting, that they are not very aware of the decision-making processes in urban settings, and that is a key problem. And we wanted to change that, and we expected something to change, but nothing happened. Exactly. This is my opinion.
Thank you, Gyula, for the Hungarian perspective. Very helpful. Now I'd like to continue with the second question, because we run under the time pressure. As the COVID-19 heightened the city's most pressing challenges like excessive pollution, climate crisis, social exclusion, or the low resilience, in the same time, the pandemic created a great number of new opportunities for companies, public authorities, citizens, non-profit organizations, academia. In this context, could you please briefly identify the new urban solutions that address urban sustainability, like, for example, the new planning concepts, like the city, compact city, car-free city, or the new cycling routes?
If you don't mind, I would continue speaking with
course,
these
please.
kind of democratic innovations, because we didn't just want to measure how people can be involved through digital innovations like online voting, but also somehow we try to redefine the urban planning process. And since the public transportation was not very useful during the COVID, we started to use alternative ways of using public parks and new alternative ways of transportation. And for example, in Szeged, people started to use public parks even more, but they were keeping a very strict distance between groups. And you could see people, because they were in their rooms, they were closed down in their flats, they needed the urban green. So what here in Szeged, we experienced that when the weather was very nice, the visitor number of urban public parks were peaking. It was very hard to keep the distance, and that made us realize that maybe just a short and brief involvement of people in planning these urban green areas can help us to exploit those settings we didn't know as an urban treasure we had. So that was something as an innovation. And of course, public routes were new bike routes and bike lanes were done in Budapest, for example. And there were a lot of pressure against them, but now they are very well accepted.
Okay, thank you again. Any other opinion?
Maybe I would just like to add that when we usually look at the metropolitan process, or the process of metropolization, we consider it as, or have considered it as considerably stable. And in this case, the pandemic has resulted in something which came unexpected, namely the necessity of introducing all these digital technologies in, let's say, in places which were, well, I would say not necessarily prepared, right? Well, this is, Julia, basically what you were also saying, but I'm talking about small towns in this respect. Some of the towns that we analyzed have actually, spontaneously introduced some means, had to, were forced to, and this really was proceeding quite successfully, with the result that now we can talk about an actual narrowing of the civilization gap, which, as I said, came completely unexpectedly because the metropolitan process would go on as it was going on, right? So this is, something that I'd like to add to that.
Thank you, Eva.
Nahid has his hand up as well.
Sure, if I may go on, sure. And nothing has happened in the pandemic, especially one of the greatest innovations we have seen was virtual world and how it's important into the pandemic process. In that virtual infrastructure, we have seen it doesn't matter if somebody is living in the rural areas or possibly in the urban areas. The sense of the boundaries of urban versus rural has been kind of immersed. So we have loosened that sense. So I think that will be one important catalyst of post-pandemic planning practices into the future, is that whether we can have a strong sense of urban versus suburban, or even rural areas, if we have much more infrastructure that may go around virtual process and digitalization process, and if that could be one important change, which might be also challenging the contemporary planning practices, and also that we have seen cities versus all those other administrative areas of connotations.
Maybe I can ask John to comment a little bit on the same theme in China. I know traditionally the Chinese have lived in very small spaces and therefore have sort of used outdoor spaces very intensively. You know, a trip to Beijing a few years ago, all the parks were absolutely full of people. The amount of private space, the size of apartments has increased. People are modernizing, and one would imagine to some degree the use of parks dropped a little bit. Certainly the use of bicycles and those kinds of modes that we associate with more active transportation, more sustainable modes of transportation disappeared as well. John, did you see a return to sort of previous patterns, sort of pre-reform era patterns, more use of bicycles, more use of green spaces in China during the pandemic?
Well, it's a mixed result, actually, because the introduction of the dockless shared bicycle in 2016, of course, saw a flood of such bicycles onto the street, and a replacement of trips that were previously taken by bus ended up on bicycles, and that's right across all the at least cities that had flat topography. A huge rise. Now that kind of leveled off, though. It leveled off, and it's there, I think, for good now, because it's part of the transportation system. And now the thing is to look for infrastructure to actually support it. But I don't think the mayors are quite there yet. The mayors and party secretaries are terribly interested these days in innovation. They want their cities to be on the map. And that doesn't involve so much the creation of public space or green space, but essentially smart city technology and other kinds of tools to make the city more efficient. I think we have to wait to see what happens with the demand for public space. Certainly the shopping malls, when they lifted the pandemic controls in Beijing, the shopping malls were suddenly packed with people. In fact, the numbers were higher than they were before the pandemic. So it clearly indicates a desire on the part of the people to get out, mix with other people, and have a public life again. So we've seen that, and there's a big demand for it. But the question is when mayors and party secretaries will begin to influence the planning process to make that more possible.
Okay, thank you so much. Please, Professor Jani.
Yeah, well, let's stay with that, John. I just well, Julia mentioned, and this was true certainly in Canada as well. When the lockdowns were in place, people were allowed to get out, as long as they were outside and kind of away from each other. And therefore parks and bicycle riding and walks and things like that happened. John, that wasn't the case in China, though. The lockdowns meant you simply couldn't leave your apartment at all. Is that right? So it had less of an effect on demand for the use of public space?
In most cases, people were allowed to exit their apartments and stay within the estate, the housing estate. 小区. So they could. So you got a community of maybe 10,000 people, and that shared space inside could be used. I know there were some extreme cases where people were actually required to stay inside their apartments, but that's quite exceptional. For the most part, they were permitted to use those common spaces within the estates. So when hindsight is always 20/20, you'd say, well, that was a good thing that they created these shared common spaces in the developments, because that had been criticized for a long time as privatized public space, essentially. But during the pandemic, it turned out to be a great resource for just this kind of thing, of getting out, breathing fresh air and seeing neighbors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Some of my research has looked into these kind of gated estates that comprise modern development in China, and from a North American perspective, it's not street friendly. It's all very internally oriented, and it's not what we call good city building. You're right to say that it actually has come in handy during this. That's interesting. Well, I've got a few questions. Thank you, Cesar. So let me just start here. Many of the great urban infrastructures projects of the 19th century were related to outbreaks of disease, specifically cholera. Among these were New York Central Park, which was described as the great green lungs that allowed the city to breathe. In Paris, Haussmann's boulevards. Yes, there were great modes of transportation, but they were also rights of way for giant new sewers and water mains. And in London, of course, Bazalgette's sewer system was put in the 19th century. So disease has always been, in some ways, a motivator for innovation and infrastructure investment. Along with other factors, however, outbreak of disease in the 19th century contributed to suburbanization. As cities were increasingly seen to be dangerous and unsanitary, residents with the means to do so decamped to the periphery. So we see a lot of people, we see suburbanization really being spawned by these disease outbreaks, among other things, these disease outbreaks in cities. So today's speakers are observing some of the same phenomena. While suburbanization in the 19th century was facilitated by new forms of transportation, trains and subways and streetcars, ultimately automobiles, suburbanization and larger demographic shifts during COVID were facilitated by digital communication technologies. Now, Professor Corcelli addresses the different impact of COVID on smaller communities than larger ones, and notes that these demographic shifts went well beyond the suburban periphery. Small towns well outside of large metropolitan areas also felt the impact. And it's interesting to compare these shifts to what happened in Canada and in the US, where real estate values during COVID dropped in large cities. New York City, for instance, lost population during COVID, but increased substantially in suburbs and in small towns during the same period. So understanding that there are many, many issues at play, is the ability to relocate something we associate with non-socialists or post-socialist countries? And Professor Corcelli, understanding, again, a variety of issues at play, do you see the redistribution of population that you've described as a temporary phenomenon? Will people start returning to cities as the pandemic abates, or has COVID and the technologies and infrastructures that it's engendered ushered in and indeed accelerated new patterns of population redistribution? That's for you, Eva.
Well, that came quite unexpectedly, and it's quite a challenging question, I would say, because if I'd known the answer, I mean, I would be, yes, I would be a very important person. Yes.
Even more important person.
Definitely, much more important than today. I would say that, well, based on the research that has been done until now, because we're talking about scientific knowledge and not common knowledge, basically we can say that some trends will be here for good, well, especially those that are related to technology, right? Because of these this technology revolution, which allowed people to stay in remote places. So this is like this double remote possibility, right? And because of the attractivity or attractiveness of smaller urban units, maybe I'm talking not about the rural areas, but about smaller towns in general, I would say that that this is generally a chance for them in a way, because the residents can who have learned to value, and not necessarily the ex-residents, because as I was saying, those were not always ex-residents who moved back, right, for good, but new residents from larger cities. I would say they who learned to value such assets as that slow life and natural amenities and all these other assets. I would say they will be able to consider. I would dare to say this: consider whether to stay or not. But this will, of course, depend again on the economy, right? Because at the end of the day, everything depends on the economy. So this, I think we're still a bit in the sphere of fantasy in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Valerievich, a broad range of infrastructure is required to support the redistribution of population, such as the ones you've described in Belgrade. Are governments supporting new urban patterns by investing in the infrastructure?
Thank you, Professor, for your question. I think not at all, because after COVID-19 we have pressure of urban traffic systems in the city of Belgrade. But now we have some interesting projects, like Jula said, in Hungary, or Eva in Poland, to take more for renewable energy resources, or to find ways to rebuild the new bicycle routes in the city, or to use more electric vehicles, something like that. Because we are now in transformation, and Belgrade has many uninhabited settlements, and also the main problem is in the connection, because there is not enough bicycle routes or pedestrian routes, something like that, and because of that we have pressure for everything. But I want to say only that the one main phenomenon is after COVID-19 we have relocation of main inhabitants of the Belgrade to the rural part of the Belgrade, and this produced that many rural settlements now in the pressure, like in the center part of the Belgrade, and because of that it is necessary to plan it more well, the special planning, and to include the new special planning laws, but supported by government.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in both the case of Poland and to some degree in Serbia, I guess at the root of my question is, did the socialist system to some degree moderate the quote unquote natural tendency towards suburbanization that happened in democratic countries over the course of the 20th century? And are we seeing a kind of a shift toward outward movement in post-socialist countries now that we saw earlier in other countries? John, by contrast, China has seen rapid urbanization. In other words, people were artificially kept away from cities. And over the course of the 20th century, well, actually the last several decades, there's been an attempt to kind of move people into cities. So we don't necessarily see the same rural to urban shifts in China, where mobility is a little more highly controlled. Can you describe a little bit about what kinds of urban patterns resulted from COVID or that we expect to see in China? You might mention the movement from first tier to second or third tier cities.
Right. Well, maybe the most important change has been for the migrant population, the so-called floating population, those 280 million people who don't have residential permits in the cities in which they work. So they were mostly employed in the small and medium-sized businesses, which suffered greatly during the pandemic, and of course there was a move back to villages and county towns right across the country. But not everyone moved, because as the government ramped up its investment in infrastructure, that created more jobs, especially construction jobs. So not all migrants actually left the cities, and then an additional large number were needed for home deliveries of food and essentials. So that created new job opportunities for the migrant population. So it's a mix, but I have heard, and it seems to be confirmed, that the largest cities have lost population. I mean, not official population, but total population. And the first tier cities, those four biggest cities, been declining in population. Beijing has been declining in population. That's partly government driven. They wanted to reduce the population to 21 million and succeeded in doing so. And Shanghai has seen something like that. Shenzhen is a slightly different picture. Guangzhou saw a decline as well. So but the fastest growth cities are the so-called second tier cities, Hangzhou, Wuhan, Xi'an, these cities. And again, that's government driven to relieve pressure on those four largest cities. So it's I just one brief word about suburbanization. While the cities have grown very rapidly, largest cities have grown very rapidly, they've also become less dense. So the others talked about suburbanization. Well, there is a kind of suburbanization that's happened in China as well, because all that transport infrastructure enabled the development of fairly dense housing, but quite distant from the core areas. So all of the cities in China, I might not say all, but nearly all cities have declined in density over time. People have demanded more space to live, but also more space around them. And of course, the transport infrastructure needed a lot more room as well. So it's a maybe slightly different situation than one can see in Europe or North America.
So while the overall population increased, the geographic expansion of cities allowed the density to decrease. It is interesting in China when we think about suburbanization. If you compare it to North America, where we imagine the single-family detached house, that's not what suburbanization looks like in China at all. But as you suggest, there are these extremely large housing estates comprised of high-rises that are essentially gated communities on the far periphery. Last question then. When asked about the ability to work virtually, Bill Mitchell, who was one of the fellows that started the Media Lab at MIT, famously observed that, quote, "Just because you can choose to be anywhere doesn't mean you'll choose to be nowhere," unquote. Professor Corcelli, we saw an image of a beautiful medieval town behind you during your presentation. To what degree does the architectural character of a town play into its appeal for people choosing to leave cities? And probably more to the point, is there a relationship between social cohesion and the size, the urban form, and the architectural character of a place? That's for you, Eva.
Yeah, let's say the first part of the question is for me, okay? So maybe somebody will continue with the second. Okay, because what I would definitely want to say is that architectural value is part of cultural heritage, right? And cultural heritage is one of the assets next to, for example, natural assets, right? Which is and social assets. For example, the possibility of leading a slow life, or let's say social cohesion in a way, right? In smaller urban places, which is definitely a pull factor, right? So I would say that if we look at this as a set, right? Architectural value belonging to cultural heritage and all these other factors as a set, then yes, I wouldn't say that architectural value itself would be enough. Right? Including, of course, urban form, that is the planning and so on and so on. When you in my background, you can see a city in the north, in fact, in the north of in the little town in the north of Poland, Reszel, with a beautiful marketplace, right? So this is an example, right? And of course, it has other amenities, which are pull factors, not only its architectural value.
Yeah, thank you. Gyula, did you want to comment? Seeing something similar in Hungary?
Yes, I have to agree with Eva because I do think that the architecture and the local culture is very important in creating local identities. What we examined in Hungary that during this COVID-led suburbanization or sometimes counter-urbanization processes in very remote areas resulted huge fault lines in the society, because people from the capital city Budapest or large cities just moved to the rural areas, and then they realized that the lifestyle is totally different than they have expected. So they had some kind of rural idyll in their mind, and suddenly they felt very excluded from a local society. It doesn't mean that they are excluded, but they had to somehow to be involved in the local community. And now what we see that they started to cooperate and they started to make decisions together. But that was a huge fault line during the COVID pandemic in the beginning, because they had this chance as escaping for the poor rural areas, these wealthy citizens from the capital city. And that was very strange that you could see on social media that, oh my God, I never thought that the rural Hungary is like that. This is so rural and things like that. And it was very funny. Like, I asked myself the question, like, what have you expected? Like, this is the rural Hungary, but they didn't know what the real rural Hungary is. So the COVID pandemic, in this sense, torn a fault line between the society, but in one sense, in another sense, they somehow realized what real Hungary is, and people started to cooperate more, and then they decided, okay, why not to eliminate this kind of divide between the capital or regional cities and the rural Hungary. So I see a big opportunity to create local identities through these pandemic years. And yes, architecture and the local setting is very important. The more important, from my perspective, is to involve people and to understand each other. And that was one key thing which we measured here during the COVID pandemic.
If I could maybe add just one more thing. Well, the difference between Hungary and Poland may be also that Poland is much more polycentric, right? So our urban network is completely different, both functionally, right, and morphologically. So in this respect, I would even dare to say that these division lines have somehow become more transparent than they had been before the pandemic, right? So less polarization than before. I would dare to say that. Maybe it's quite risky at this moment, but I'll dare to say it.
Whereas I would say in Canada and the US, the rural-urban divide has become so much more, I don't know what I want to say, deep than it was before the pandemic. And there are redistributions of population where people are moving just because they want to be closer to people that think like them. So we're seeing this kind of massive division. Julia, you talk about fault lines. There have been massive fault lines through North America because of the pandemic, and it's creating a completely different kind of political structure. Nahid, please join in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ben. Because I was looking into Southeast Asian perspectives, that how things have been kind of transforming during the pandemic, also post-pandemic time. I think is quite prominent in countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. There is a change agent-based, transformation process going around, especially because cities in those countries were very much asking for economical revival and how they could survive in the pandemic, and there was not much of I would say infrastructure or investments from the top-down planning approach. There was more like self-driven survival strategies that they have seen in those countries. But people were very much active in terms of they become the change agents, and they were contributing to the economy in terms of how they could survive and live through the pandemic. And that one important things came up is change agent-driven, let's say, process of development, which was not properly much stronger in the pre-era of, or in socialistic era in such sense. And especially we have seen in Cambodia is quite interesting, even though the central government was trying to impose policies and restrictions onto making sure that the tourist industry would be flourishing and becoming the key, I would say, line for economic development. But there's not much of further assistance from the top level. But we have seen in the down level, people are very much active. They're very much interactive and cooperating each other to make sure they can be really making sure the tourist industry is active despite all those restrictions, right? So that kind of very important thing we have seen in Southeast Asian perspectives, that people become much more active, much more become the change agents, so they could influence the planning practices in certain extent, and that would help the economy to survive and live through the pandemic and also in the post era.
I would describe that as enlightened self-interest. Maybe it comes out of what John has said too, in that shift from a socialist to a post-socialist, this idea that people are supposed to look after themselves. Here in North America, I keep thinking there's a major distinction between the idea that people look after themselves and that people look after each other. There's a very strong ethos that you look after yourself, but there's still not an understanding of what it means to look after each other. Anyway, I just throw that out there. Cesar, are there people in the room that might want to ask questions? Should I turn it back over to you, or do you want to comment on anything from the Romanian perspective?
In the beginning, we had nine guests, and I have to tell you that I'm really sorry to say it. I mean, we're having only 2 guests left at this moment, so I don't know. But please, if you have any questions, any of you, any kind of questions,
We switch free.
I think they said no, and we can continue up. Anyway, we're a little bit we're running out of time because it's already 4 p.m. 2 minutes after 4 p.m. the local time, and I think they're preparing for another session.
Okay, great. Well, with that, then I think
all of you.
Thank all of our presenters, Julian Naj, Eva Kocelli, John Zacharias, Professor Nahid, and Professor Valerievich. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to meet you all and interact with you. To kind of experiment with the very technologies we're describing, to pull a group together from around the world and to talk about things so globally. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Cesar. It's been a pleasure working with you.
The same. My pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor.
The same for you, for all of you.
Great. Well, with that, we'll call this session to a close, and we look forward to continuing the discussion in other media.
Thank you so much,
everybody.
Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for all.
Bye, everyone.